Thank you. You shouldn't thank me. I've got to thank you for allowing me to talk about a subject that's very dear to my heart. I think, well, I hope that you'll enjoy it. I know that I enjoy working in this subject. I thought that I'd start talking about Reginald Moreau, which I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, and the work that he did 50 years ago. And I'd start with this paragraph, with this excerpt from his 1972 work, The Palearctic African Bird Migration Systems. And he says, subsequently, Troll has offered another reconstruction of the vegetation of Europe at the same glacial stage, the last glacial maximum, which is even more bleak in that the richest vegetation shown anywhere in Iberia is wooded steppe. Personally, because of the variation in topography and rainfall across Iberia, I find it difficult to believe that at any stage its vegetation can have been so uniform as wooded steppe, descending to all the coastlines. Now, this was written in 1972. As you've probably gathered, I am going to be basing this talk on a talk that I gave in the Calpe conference last year, where I met Ellie, and we were commemorating the work of the great ornithologist Reginald Moreau. My apologies to those of you who attended already, because I will be going over a lot of the ground that I presented there. So as I said, this work by Moreau was written 50 years ago, and it shows two things. It shows the bleak view of Iberia as it was then, and in many ways is still now. And it also shows that Moreau understood the role of topography in shaping climate and the environment. I think it shows the kind of person that he was, and it comes across very much so in his work. Now, Clive a few weeks ago already spoke to this group, and he mentioned Gibraltar. And today I'm going to start with a little bit more detail on what we do here. This is Gorham's Cave on the east side of the Rock of Gibraltar. And we know that as far back as 1954, from published work, Moreau knew about Gorham's Cave, excavations that had been carried out in that cave by the archaeologist John Darcy Vector, who had been working in those caves between 1948 and 1954. This cave is Vanguard Cave. Now, Vanguard Cave was unknown to Moreau because the site hadn't been excavated in his day. And incidentally, before I carry on, and I have to say it, these caves are part of the Gorham's Cave complex, which was declared a World Heritage Site in 2016. And it covers the entire face, all this area. The face of the cliffs of the Rock of Gibraltar that you can see. The summit, right up here, is 426 meters above sea level, and the caves that we have been working on, and that I will be talking mainly about, I will mention other caves, are found at sea level today. We've spent nearly 30 years, in fact, over 30 years now, excavating in Gorham's and Vanguard caves. And these caves have yielded huge amounts of information, not just on bird remains, but we've also been able to find out about other animals and plants that were present in the late Pleistocene. This material is helping us to reconstruct the climatic and environmental conditions here in fine detail. Let me take you through the salient points. Gorham's and Vanguard caves have long stratigraphies. The depth of the sediments in Gorham's is 18 meters, and in Vanguard, this is Vanguard Cave here, it's 17 meters. They span the entire last glacial cycle from about 127,000 years ago to the start of the Holocene, which, according to the latest chronologies, started about 11.7 thousand years ago. Let's briefly recap on what happened during the last glacial cycle and its current definitions. At the base of this chart, is the timescale in thousands of years. And at the top are the marine isotope stages, or the MIS. Typically, the odd-numbered stages represent interglacials or warm periods. And even numbers represent the MIS, sorry, MIS3 is from about 57 to 30,000 years ago. And this never reached the full warmth of the interglacials.
Okay.
The temperature curve, based on the Greenland ice core delta 18 oxygen, shows us warm interglacial from about 132,000 to 116,000 years ago. Yeah. And this is followed by a protracted period of decreasing temperatures between 116 and 30,000 years ago. That's that arrow there. Leading to the last glacial maximum, the LGM, between 26 and 19,000 years ago. And I will also highlight the penultimate glacial maximum, the PGM, which wasn't quite as severe as the LGM, as you can see there, and which occurred between 71 and 60,000 years ago. The recovery to the present day conditions that we see today starts after 19,000 years ago. And one important point about this sequence, as you can see, is that there are multiple oscillations in temperature showing the great instability of climatic conditions during this period. Sometimes in our minds, it's easy to sort of even out the curves, but it's constantly changing. And one final point to bear in mind from this graph is the supplanting of the Atlantic temperate forest. And you can see that in that side of the graph. The supplanting of the Atlantic temperate forest, which I'm showing in green by the steppe or the orange in this pollen record from the Bay of Biscay, which is Western France. Coming back to our caves, this is an example of the level of detail and the resolution of the information that we're getting. This is the case of Vanguard Cave. And I like to refer to this as the day in the life of the Neanderthals, because this level of resolution is unusually high. We have a case in one of the levels where we've got evidence of we find that they've probably been collecting these mussel shells on the coast. They've brought them into the cave. They've put them on the hot coals for the mussels to start opening. And whilst they're waiting for the food to be ready, they've started sharpening their stone tools. And so we find also evidence of debitage around the fireplace. We think from the small size of that fire and the small number of mussel shells that it was probably just one or two people involved in this. But the interesting thing is that once they finish consuming their mussels, they may have stayed on a little while longer, but then they leave and there's no evidence of any disturbance. The dune covers this event, and 40, 50,000 years later, we come along and we excavate it. So that's the level of resolution that we get from this particular site. This is very important because this gives us a lot of information. In some of the caves, you get quite good resolution, but maybe a centimeter of sediment is covering 1,000 years. Not so in Vanguard Cave in particular. So what is it exactly that we excavate in these levels, you might be asking? Well, we frequently find the remains of hearths made by the Neanderthals. In this case, as far back as 48,000 years ago. This is the slide that I'm showing you today at the moment. And in addition to animal remains, which you can see there, we find charcoal. Now, charcoal not only allows us to date the levels by the radiocarbon method, it also allows us to identify the woody plants that were used. And these are not the only macrofossil remains that we find. Here are some beautifully preserved stone pine bracts that were left in the fire. Possibly they put the pine cones into the fire either to start the fire, because they're rich in resin, or to eat the pine nuts. And one other element, which isn't visible because of its size, obviously, is the pollen that we also find in these sediments. This is very important. But there's another source of pollen, and this is one that gets me very excited, and I always find it quite funny. That we can get so excited after. Coprolites are just dung that has started fossilizing, and we call them coprolites. But they are very rich in pollen. Now, you might be asking yourselves, yeah, well, hyenas are carnivores. How can their dung be rich in pollen? Well, it's not an accident, if you like. The hyenas predate on herbivores that are roaming the plains, and they are consuming plants, and therefore the gut of these herbivores is rich in pollen. The hyena comes along and consumes practically the entire prey. Now, this is important because hyenas eat so much of the bone that their droppings are very rich in calcium, and so they become, they fossilize very well, and they preserve the contents of the dung. Then we come along. This is an optical microscope in a diagram, but we're using electron microscopes. We can actually identify the pollen grains in that dung, and that gives us information on the species of plants that were collected in this pollen, and we can start some way to reconstruct the environment that the herbivores and the hyenas were roaming. There's a point, the extra point, if you like, a question of scale. When you look at the pollen collected in this way, because the herbivores have their own range, and then the hyenas are moving across the countryside in their own territory, the pollen that's being collected by this method is from a much greater scale than the information that we're going to get from the charcoal that has been brought into the cave by people collecting vegetation to use as fuel for their hearths, for their fires. Now, you're not going to lug a tree for kilometers to bring it to a cave to start a fire. You're going to collect whatever vegetation there is in the immediate vicinity of the cave. And so it gives us, if you like, two different scales. So let's concentrate then on the well-studied pollen and charcoal records that we have from two levels, levels 4 and level 3 in Gorham's Cave in particular. Dates from 35,106 to 28,412 years ago. That's marked in the little red line there. Level 3 sequence dates from 20,505 to 15,043,000 years ago. Now, as you can see, these sequences coincide with the onset of the last glacial maximum and the initial subsequent recovery. So that's the onset of the last glacial maximum, and there we have the beginning of the recovery. But they do represent a significantly colder time. The global conditions at the time were much colder than they are today. In Atlantic France, for example, at this time, it continued to be a steppe-dominated sequence. So what does Gorham's Cave tell us that's happening at that same time? Well, the charcoal sequence from level 4 is dominated by Pinus pinea or Pinus pinnaster. They're difficult to tell apart, with major contributions of Pinus nigra sylvestris, juniperus, herbaceae, which are legumes, Cystacea, which are the rock roses, Olea, the olive, and Erica, the heathers. The cave sediment pollen spectra show relatively high frequencies of juniperus, Pinus, Ericaceae, Poaceae. You can see that, the grasses and the daisies, the Cystaceae, and also to a lesser extent, Ilex aquifolium, which is holly, Artemisia, the mugworts, and the goosefoots. Among arboreal pollen components, Olea and Pistacea are worth mentioning, together with Betula, the birch, Corylus, Fraxinus, Quercus, and Salix, which is the willow. The charcoal sequence from level 3 is still dominated by strobilules or pine cones and charred woods of Pinus pinea and Pinaster, accompanied by Juniperus, Quercus, Arbutus unedo, Fraxinus, Fabaceae, etc. And the pollen sequence for levels of pine and grasses, the pollen from the pine and grass, obviously, and a decrease in juniper relative to level 4, and peaks of Ericaceae. There's several minor components which show minor increases with respect to level 4, like Asphodelus, Olea, Lamiaceae, Salix, and Quercus. This level also includes a diversity of trees and shrubs like Abies, which is the fir, Acer, the maple, Ulmus, the alder, Betula, the birch, Corylus, Fuxinus, Ilex, Juglans, and many others. The pollen-bearing coprolites show great variability in the pollen percentages, with the main dominants being Pinus, Poaceae, Quercus, and Juniperus. Other pollen taxa reach relatively high values in some samples like Artemisia, Cyperaceae, Cistaceae, Plantago, Ericaceae, and Asteraceae. A variety of trees, shrubs, and herbs is also apparent, including conifers like Taxus, Pinus, Pinaster, broadleaf trees like Corylus, Alnus, Betula, etc., Mediterranean scrub, understory, xerothermic scrub, and a number of heliophytes like Ericaceae, Geniste, Asphodelius, Artemisia. Note also the dominance of arboreal pollen in the majority of the samples. This is quite important. If we consider the charcoal evidence, it reflects mainly the woody component and the environment close to the cave, like I've already mentioned. And this evidence suggests that the late Pleistocene landscape surrounding Gorham's Cave was characterized by stands of pine and to a lesser extent juniper, with grasses, composites, and other shrubs and herbs, and patches of woodland comprising of a variety of taxa. And then, as we already mentioned, the coprolite pollen, on the other hand, is going to be reflecting a much larger diversity of the vegetation types that you find in the region. So during the period from 35 to 50, 15,000 years ago, the Strait of Gibraltar, juniper, and mixed woodlands, savannas, riverine forest patches, heliophytic matorrals, rocky scrub, grasslands with heaths, shrubby grasslands, and steppe-like salt marshes and littoral vegetation right across the coasts. Savannas with pine, oak, and juniper in the arboreal layer may well have been widespread along the coastal shelf eastward of Gorham's Cave. But you might be wondering where all these plant remains come from. I've just made reference to the coastal shelf east of Gorham's, but as you can see in that picture there, there's the sea just outside Gorham's. Well, one impact that was felt as a result of the variations in global temperatures during the last glacial cycle was sea level change. We're all familiar with that. But you can see how sea levels were constantly fluctuating with a general lowering trend that coincides neatly with the temperature curve that I showed you earlier. And I think it's very striking to see just how much fluctuation there was. One impact, there we go. One impact that can be seen quite clearly when I put the blue line, which shows the present day sea level, and then the other blue line which shows the mean sea level in this cycle, is exactly that, the variation in the sea levels. Now I've put it here at around, pointing with the wrong pointer. I put it here at around minus 80 meters below the present sea levels, because when you calculate it very roughly, in the last 130,000 years, the average for about 80% of the time, the sea level was about 80 meters below the present sea level. That's the last glacial maximum there. So what this meant is that outside Gorham's Cave, which I show here by the black dots there, that's Gorham's Cave, and the gray represents the Rock of Gibraltar, there was a plain corresponding to the coastal shelf, and this was uncovered as to a depth of about 100 meters from the present sea level. At that depth, there's a sharp drop-off, and any further lowering of sea levels would have made very little difference in terms of exposing further tracts of land. But I think there's a sufficient, you can see exactly how much the land actually was exposed and how little of it is there now. You know, we think that now is the common thing, but we're living in exceptional times. So that gives you an idea of the land that was exposed at the height of the glacial maximum. So we've established that not all of Iberia was wooded steppe, and certainly not down to the coastlines. So Moreau, over 50 years ago, was correct in his interpretations, in spite of the limited data available to him at the time. We could, however, be criticized that we've only demonstrated a rich floristic and vegetation diversity in one site. So how representative is Gibraltar of conditions across coastal Iberia? Well, in this map, what I show is the corresponding sea level drop at the last glacial maximum for southwestern Iberia and northwest Africa. And now I'm briefly going to present here the results of pollen sequences from El Asperillo cliffs in the Doñana National Park. That's in this area. We are here, and it's in this area. And we published these in the Review of Paleobotany and Palynology in 2021. And these dunes are situated about 160 kilometers away from us. And this is a photograph showing one of the sampling points. So the following sequences that we studied cover this period between 30,900 and 22,000 years ago, which falls incredibly neatly in between the two study times that we've got at Gorham. So it's the blue one that I'm referring to now. So it complements the Gibraltar sequences, and it also coincides with a particularly cold and dry Heinrich event too. So what's happening at that time? This is just one pollen sequence from the site. I'm really interested in me going into all that level of points. As you can see, there we go. There's always a dominance of arboreal over non-arboreal pollen. And we're looking at woodland during the worst climatic conditions of the last glacial cycle. It's important. There's a rich diversity of mesothermophilous plants, those that favor or prefer to live in temperate zones. There's a rich diversity of Mediterranean plants, perhaps not unsurprisingly. There's a rich diversity of xerophytes. Those are plants that need very little water. There's a presence of aquatic plants. And note the overall dominance of pines and junipers, which I show with the green bars. So for those of you who don't know Doñana well, these last glacial maximum pollen sequences are revealing a virtually identical picture to the Doñana that we see today. They're also giving us an almost identical picture to that of the late Pleistocene vegetation outside Gorham's Cave. So now we can at least say with some degree of confidence that the Gorham's Cave picture is representative of the vegetation on the coastal shelf, which today is largely submerged, of southwest Iberia and probably northwest Africa during the cold conditions of the late MIS3 and the last glacial maximum, and that we find a modern analog in the Doñana National Park itself today. In 2018, we published another paper in Paleobotany and Palynology, where we looked at pollen sequences across the entire Iberian Peninsula that had mesothermophilous taxa. We looked at marine isotope stage 4, which you will recall was the penultimate glacial cycle, penultimate glacial, MIS3 and MIS2, which included the last glacial maximum. Let's look at MIS4 first. The blue dots represent mesothermophilous taxa, that is temperate vegetation. The green dots represent mesothermophilous taxa. That includes sclerophyllous elements. Sclerophyllous elements are just vegetation that's adapted to long periods of dryness and heat. And these would be the evergreen oaks, the olive, Eolia, Pistacea, Phyllorea, Myrtus, Buxus, and Rhamnus. The red dots represent mesothermophilous taxa that includes sclerophylls and Ibero-Maghrebian scrub, like Mytina, Periploca, Sisyphus, Withania, Lycium, and Calicotum. So essentially what we're showing are vegetation refugial sites going from temperate in blue to warm Mediterranean in red. The striking thing is the presence of these vegetation types across much of coastal Iberia, including the north, and also in a few inland valleys. And before I go on to the next slide, if you're wondering about these dots in the ocean, it's just that they represent seabed cores and with the pollen that's been found in those. Okay, so this is the pattern for MIS3. There are many more sites than for MIS4, and that's probably just a sampling bias. But note the presence of Mediterranean vegetation in the south and the southeast. And the pattern is replicated for MIS2, which incredibly is the most severe moment of the last glacial cycle. You'll agree that we can confidently now discard the notion that Iberia was one uniform wooded steppe during glacial conditions. Okay, so what happened to the birds? It's clear from what we've heard so far that the conditions in the Iberian Peninsula, at least, were not as bleak as have been painted by some, and that opportunities would have existed for Palearctic African migrants, looking mainly at the species listed by Moreau in 1972, to return to breed each spring. Now, I will summarize the Palearctic African migrant species whose remains have been found in Gibraltar's caves. Sahara rock shelter, which was excavated by Dorothy Garrett in 1926, and Ibex cave, which we excavated more recently. In all, we've identified 47 species in 85 archaeological levels, and they represent a third of all the species whose remains have been found in the caves. Turning to the two Gorham's cave levels that I described earlier, we find that in level 4, a third of the species identified are Palearctic African migrants. Level 3 has a similar proportion of Palearctic African migrants. These results leave no doubt as to their presence in Gibraltar and presumably in similar habitats in Southwest Iberia during the coldest glacial conditions experienced in Europe. So how important would the coastal habitats of late Pleistocene Southwest Iberian have been to the Palearctic African migrants? Well, some time back, we carried out monthly transects within the biological reserve at Doñana that we've been talking about. And we did this over a period of 3 years on a monthly basis. So now I'm going to summarize our results in just 2 graphs, and they'll illustrate just how important these habitats are to Palearctic African migrants today. Here I show the seasonal distribution of these migrants by numbers of individuals out of the total birds counted in each transect. The importance of these migrants in these habitats during the migration seasons and also the breeding season is clear. The proportion of migrants exceeding 70% of all the birds in some instances. The contribution by species is similarly high. And the Palearctic African migrants frequently account for over half of all the species present in these habitats. So these habitats have always been key to these migrants, now and in the Pleistocene. Now, quoting Moreau again, he says, Mediterranean and others are numerous. Moreau was clearly thinking about the problems related to the impact of climate change on birds in the Pleistocene as far back as 1954, when he published an important paper, The Main Vicissitudes of the European Avifauna Since the Pliocene. Our results from Gibraltar show that some of these species were able to survive the glaciations, and at least in the south of Europe, possibly elsewhere, but at least in the south of Europe. Judging from the vegetation maps that I've shown you, we suggest that the pattern was reflected along much of the Iberian coastline. But let me just digress at this point and talk about a non-migratory species, the Iberian magpie. It illustrates something that we've been talking about. Now, for a long time, this bird was known as the azure-winged magpie. This is its present distribution in the Iberian Peninsula. It's found nowhere else in Europe or North Africa. And this is a little bit closer. Note that it's not found anywhere near Gibraltar today, as you can see from the red arrow. Now, its current distribution is quite odd in that it's also found in East Asia. And for a long time, the consensus was that these colorful birds had been brought back to Europe by the first Portuguese mariners in the Middle Ages, when they started exploring the Far East. They're very pretty birds. So it was thought that these Western magpies had been brought back to Europe, and they were held to have been escapees. So nobody could have imagined that this pattern reflected an extreme case of disjunct distribution. So this is what they thought that the Portuguese mariners were doing. They were just taking them back with them in their ships. Then came a surprise. When we found the remains of these birds in Gorham's and Vanguard caves, dating back to over 40,000 years. Clearly, the introduction be shelved. There were no Portuguese mariners at that time. So showed their distinctness, with a separation estimated at between 1 and 3 million years ago. The alien population retains the name, the azure-winged magpie, and its Latin name is Cyanopica cyanus. And then the Iberian population is now considered a distinct species and is now called the Iberian magpie, Cyanopica cooki. That's one of the bone remains that we found. But there is one more twist to this tale, and I think it's a neat one. On the bottom right is a histogram showing the tree density in territories occupied by Iberian magpies today from our own fieldwork. It clearly shows that the habitat of this species is a wooded savanna with scattered trees, but neither forest nor treeless plains. The photograph above it is an example. And this means that the magpies outside our caves must have had this kind of habitat available to them. You will have gathered from what I've already said that this is exactly so. The birds have confirmed the prediction from the pollen and the charcoal. And this is a reconstruction of that habitat by Mauricio Anton, the artist who specializes in this. And notice the Iberian magpies that we asked him to include at the top left, just to make sure that it brought it home. And for those of you who are not familiar with Gibraltar, this is the reconstruction, but this is what it looks like today. So here's another twist. If the climate and habitats were, as I have described in the Pleistocene, how come we find the remains of birds like the snowy owl in the caves? And we do. Well, you don't find snowy owls anywhere in the Iberian Peninsula today, but we found their remains in Gorham's Cave. And as we've established so far, the tundra conditions that the snowy owls need never existed in Gibraltar. So we interpret these results as examples of latitude warm species to survive. So these birds, they stayed where they were, they stayed put. Instead, conditions to the north were sometimes severe, with tundra steppe right across as far south as France. Snowy owls would have bred in that tundra, and they must have migrated south in the winter to Gibraltar. So yes, in an unexpected combination, there were times when people would have been able to see a snowy owl alongside an olive tree. And the seabird pattern replicates that of the landbirds, with arrivals from the north without departures to the south, creating unusual combinations of species. And in this map, you can see the impact of the ice sheets, covering, for example, most of the United Kingdom, and the southward push of polar waters. The polar front, which is currently off Greenland, came as far south as 42 degrees north. That's the latitude of Oporto in Portugal. Seabirds had no choice but to push south as habitats in the north closed. But I don't want to extend my time with this, and it's not strictly the subject of this talk. So maybe that's the subject of a future talk. So I will finish with these images of crag martins at their winter roost in Gorham's Cave in the late Pleistocene and today by the artist Tim Morfolk. So on the left is the artist's impression of what it may have looked like some 50,000 years ago. Note that he's included the magpies and the lower sea level. And on the right is what we see today. And there we have the crag martin is in both. They're still here today. They come to winter every year, and they come to roost in these caves in huge numbers. Moreau, who started us off on this journey, and I have to say his vision with the limited information at his disposal was remarkable. He understood that to begin to comprehend Palearctic African migration, we really do need to understand the past.
Donc, je vais essayer de faire de mon mieux pour traduire en français, parce qu'il y avait beaucoup d'informations. Donc, Géraldine, elle a étudié plusieurs grottes, notamment, enfin surtout 2 grottes au détroit de Gibraltar. Ils ont fait des fouilles et ils ont essayé avec ce qu'ils ont trouvé dans ces grottes de reconstruire le climat et les conditions environnementales du passé, dans la période du Pleistocène. Ces grottes, en fait, elles sont idéales pour faire ça parce qu'elles ont une très bonne résolution, contrairement à d'autres grottes ou régions, et qui donnent des données très précises. Donc, par exemple, dans les grottes, ils ont trouvé du charbon. Et avec le charbon, on peut l'utiliser pour dater la couche géologique et dater aussi les organismes qu'il y avait à cette époque, et aussi d'identifier les espèces d'arbres qu'il y avait donc à cette époque. Mais une méthode encore plus efficace, c'est d'utiliser le pollen. Et en fait, ils ont trouvé beaucoup de pollen dans ces grottes, dans des crottes de hyènes. En fait, les hyènes qui mangent du coup des herbivores se retrouvent avec ingèrent finalement beaucoup de pollen. Et comme elles consomment les os, leurs crottes sont très riches en calcium et se fossilisent très bien. Donc, ça apporte des données très précises. Donc, grâce à ce pollen trouvé dans les crottes de hyènes, ils ont réussi à identifier la végétation qu'il y avait dans le passé, pendant la dernière période glaciaire. Et la végétation, du coup, autour de Gibraltar était complètement différente de celle qu'il y a maintenant, avec aussi beaucoup de pins et de genévriers notamment. Et en fait, le niveau de la mer était beaucoup plus bas à l'époque, en moyenne 80 mètres plus bas que maintenant, durant la dernière période glaciaire. Donc, ça concerne la côte de la péninsule ibérique, mais aussi la côte nord-africaine. Donc, il y avait une plaine autour du détroit de Gibraltar. Et voilà, et du coup, la végétation était différente. Et globalement, en fait, la végétation de toute la péninsule ibérique était beaucoup plus diversifiée. à cette époque, avec beaucoup aussi de végétation qui venait plutôt du nord de l'Europe. Donc voilà, essayer de reconstruire un peu l'habitat potentiel pendant la dernière période glaciaire. Et maintenant, si on regarde si on se focalise sur les oiseaux, donc ils ont aussi trouvé beaucoup d'espèces d'oiseaux dans les grottes. 30% des espèces qu'ils ont identifiées étaient des oiseaux migrateurs subsahariens. Et en fait, si on regarde par exemple les données du parc national de Doñana, qui a 130 km à l'ouest des étoiles de Gibraltar, la végétation qu'il y a maintenant, elle a démontré que la végétation actuelle à Doñana est similaire à celle qu'il y avait autour de Gibraltar à l'époque. Et Doñana, quand il y a des inventaires ornithologiques qui sont faits à Doñana, plus de 50% des oiseaux sont des espèces migratrices. Donc, ça démontrerait vraiment l'importance de ces habitats, qui étaient en fait du coup des sortes de savanes boisées pour les oiseaux migrateurs, maintenant et au passé aussi. Après, elle a pris l'exemple d'un oiseau résident, qui est la pie bleue. Alors, en Europe, elle est endémique de la péninsule ibérique, mais on en trouve aussi en Asie. Avant, c'était la même espèce. Donc, l'hypothèse à l'époque, c'était que sûrement cette espèce a été importée par des navigateurs portugais de l'Asie en Europe. Mais finalement, ils ont aussi trouvé des vestiges de pie bleue dans les grottes à une époque où il n'y avait pas évidemment de navigateurs portugais. Donc, elle était déjà là. Et maintenant, elle est considérée comme une espèce distincte de celle d'Asie. Et du coup, après, elle a donné l'exemple de la chouette harfang. Du coup, la chouette harfang, c'est une espèce arctique maintenant. Et certainement qu'elle n'a jamais niché dans la région de Gibraltar. Mais peut-être que comme pendant la période glaciaire, elle nichait quand même plus au sud que son aire de répartition actuelle, par exemple en France. Et à cause des conditions climatiques très rudes, peut-être en hiver, elle effectuait certainement des migrations et peut-être qu'elle migrait dans la région de Gibraltar. C'est pour ça qu'on a trouvé des restes de chouette harfang là autour. Et en conclusion, elle a voulu dire que voilà, étudier des données préhistoriques et reconstruire un peu les conditions environnementales de cette époque permettent vraiment mieux comprendre qu'est-ce que l'évolution, on va dire, des oiseaux migrateurs, l'évolution de leur répartition, et qu'est-ce qu'ils avaient besoin à l'époque et qu'est-ce qu'ils ont besoin maintenant. Et c'est quelque chose à pas parler, mais peut-être aussi permettre de comprendre qu'est-ce qu'ils auront besoin dans le futur, comme tout change très vite actuellement.